Hi, PEPSA friends. Welcome to the first inquiry video in a four-part inquiry video series created for your work in the PEPSA program. My name is Nancy Fichtman-Dana, and it is my honor to meet you and to serve as your guide through these videos and through the inquiry process. So let's go ahead and get started with the topic of the first video. And to do that, I am going to share my screen because I've created some PowerPoint slides for you to guide you through each of the videos. And we're going to start with this first video, which is simply an introduction to the inquiry process. So before I share with you a little bit about the inquiry process, introducing you to it, I wanted to first share a little bit more about me. So I have been reading about, studying, writing about, and doing inquiry myself for over 30 years. So I am passionate about the process as I have just seen over and over and over again what a positive impact inquiry can have on educators, and perhaps more importantly, on the students that they teach. So I have authored 12 books and over 100 articles on or related to the inquiry process, including the book that you will be using as a part of your PEPSA program that's seen on this slide. So that book had a slight title change from the publication of the fourth edition to the fifth edition, from The Reflective Educator's Guide to Classroom Research, Learning to Teach and Teaching to Learn Through Practitioner Inquiry. That has always been a mouthful in those first four editions. So in the publication of the fifth edition, we shortened the title to simply The Reflective Educator's Guide to Practitioner Inquiry. So let's go ahead and talk about inquiry. Here is what we're going to be doing in this video. First, we're just simply going to answer the question, what is inquiry, with a simple definition. And then once we define inquiry and discuss some different aspects of the definition, we're going to move on to the meat of the video, where I will be sharing with you 5 components of the inquiry process. And then finally, I think it's always really important for learning to not just define something, but to see how it actually looks in practice. So we are going to end this first video with an example of what a cycle of inquiry can look like. All right, so let's get going with that very first question. What is inquiry anyway? So here we go. There are lots of words that you may be familiar with and have heard kind of thrown around in educational settings. And you see those words on this screen: action research, teacher inquiry, classroom research, self-study, practitioner inquiry. And all of these words in the field of education are often used interchangeably and synonymously. What's important to know is whatever of these words you're familiar with, what we're talking about, whatever word you use, is simply this: the systematic, intentional study by teachers of their own practice. And there you have it. That is the definition of inquiry. But now let's go back to all those words that are used interchangeably. And I want to share with you why, in my work, my preference has always been the word inquiry. And to do so, I'm going to ask you in a minute, not quite yet, but in a minute, I'm going to ask you to close your eyes. And then I'm going to say one word, And when I say that word with your eyes closed, I want you to capture the first image that comes into your mind when you hear that word, almost like you're taking a picture of it. And then I'll ask you to open your eyes, and we will use that image to discuss my preference for the word inquiry. All right, so I know you're watching this video all by yourself, and so it might seem a little silly, but now is the time I want you to close your eyes. And here is the word research. Capture that first image that comes into your mind. Okay, now open your eyes. And you may very well see in front of you a similar image to what you captured in your head. When I teach about the process of inquiry, if I use the word action research or teacher research or classroom research, it usually sends some bristles up the spines of teachers when they're first introduced to the process because they think of these images that are associated with that word research. And that's, on the two corners, you see the image of a book and an image of a journal. And it's about pouring through research is about pouring through lots of books and lots of journal articles and just extended reading on a particular subject. So that might be one image, and maybe that's the one that you conjured. Another image, you kind of see a formula on this slide, a mathematics formula. Another image that often comes to mind when we think of the word research is like statistics and crunching numbers. And that, isn't something that many teachers like love and embrace. A third image that might come to your mind is just lots of hours when you think about research, filling up notebook after notebook of copious notes that you take as you engage in the research process. And then finally, another image might be the one you see on the upper right hand of your screen. And that's of like a scientist in a white lab coat that's removed from the research and has created an experimental control group and then a treatment group. And they are working to be objective and to find out through an experiment what works best. So all of these images that you see on the slide and that you might have captured in your own mind, in your own head, again, they're not something that teachers often feel like they want to embrace as a part of their work because the work life of a teacher is already so busy and you're doing so many things, making hundreds and thousands of decisions a day in your teaching practice and preparing and grading and actually doing the act of teaching. To think of adding another layer on top of that just feels a little overwhelming. So I am happy to share with you that all of these images we just discussed are really antithetical to the process of inquiry that you are going to be introduced to today and that you are going to engage in as a part of your work as a participant in the PEPSA program. Inquiry isn't something that's added on top of teaching. Inquiry is something that becomes a part of teaching. And in order to further illustrate that, and why my word that I like to use for this process is inquiry and not some of those other words, action research, teacher research, classroom research. There's nothing wrong with them, but I prefer that term inquiry to help us debunk some of the myths about what this process is about. So it is not about doing an experiment. It is not about trying to divide the children that you work with into two groups, and one gets an experimental treatment and one you do business as usual, and then you try to compare and contrast the two groups and figure out what works best. Teaching is so complex, there never is a best. So that approach to research does not make sense for a teacher inquirer. What inquiry is about is a much more naturalistic form of research. And you see on this slide somebody you might recognize. That is Jane Goodall. And you know, she is quite famous for her anthropology work and her work with primates. And her research entailed actually going and living with and within a chimpanzee community and studying the chimpanzees in their natural setting. She didn't try to put them into two different groups. She didn't try to uh, treat them in some particular way and see how that treatment worked or didn't work. Rather, she was a keen and astute observer. And this is much more about what the inquiry process is about. As a teacher, you are living within your natural setting and you're studying your natural setting and the students that you work with, observing them keenly, noticing what's happening. Okay, so I hope that helps you feel comfortable and confident moving forward with this notion of inquiry, that it isn't something on top of what you do as a teacher, but it's just a natural part of what you do as a teacher. That said, in a minute, we are going to launch into the second part of this video, which is reviewing the 5 components of the inquiry process. But before we go there, I just really want to iterate with all of you that while we're going to be learning a process that has 5 different components to it, more than anything else, what this work is all about is a way of being as a teacher. It's a way to approach the work that you do with students with autism. And what that entails is a 3-part way of being. And the first part of that is problematizing practice. Now, I think when we hear the word problems, just like we hear the word research, it brings certain images into our head. When we hear the word problems, it kind of can have a negative connotation. But one of an educational scholar and researcher that I really admire, Michael Fullan, he has talked about problems not as something negative, but rather as educators, problems are our friends. And the reason they are our friends is because teaching is just a really inherently complex act. And so is learning, right? You know, as a teacher, what works with one particular learner may or may not work with another particular learner. And what works in one year of your teaching may or may not play out the same way in the second year of your teaching, or even from Monday to Tuesday. And teaching is so complex because we're human beings. We're a human as a teacher, and we work with students who are human beings, and we are unpredictable and complex, and things can impact the teaching and learning act, such as outside things that we're experiencing and we bring into the classroom. Also, the context within which we teach and what's going on in the context where we teach, in our schools, in our communities, in our state, in our nation, in our world. All of those things are going to have an impact on what goes on every day in our classroom. So because of that, it's natural and normal for us to have problems as teachers. And rather than bemoan them or sweep them under the carpet and pretend that they don't exist, we actually embrace them and we celebrate them as a part of the work that we do as teachers, a natural part of teaching. And we celebrate them by naming them and systematically studying them. And then finally, we take action for improvement based on what we study. So, in sum, while we defined inquiry as systematic, intentional study by teachers of their own classroom practice, really, what we're talking about is simply a way to approach your teaching, this way of being where you're always curious about what's going on. You're always curious about your students that you work with and how they're making sense of the teaching and the learning act. And you use strategies to think about what's going on and notice what's going on in a very systematic and intentional way. So then you can pour what you learn from your observing and your noticing back into your teaching practice and become the very best teacher that you can be for students with autism. So again, what's really critical is to remember as we move forward, what this is all about is a way of being. And I will tell you, if you are in the PEPSA program, you already are doing this. You're already engaging in inquiry as a way of being, because you've gravitated to this program and you're curious about your teaching. You're curious about your work with students with autism, and you want to learn about and try new and different things and understand how they work in your particular context with your particular students. That's what brought you to this fantastic program. So this is something you're already doing. All we're going to be doing is creating a space within the PEPSA program for it to be a bit more intentional and visible and less happenstance in your everyday work as teachers, because the act of teaching is so busy. We do this process, this way of being, but in the busyness of the day, it's very hard to carve out time to do it in a systematic and intentional way. And so that's what we're going to do in the PEPSA program. And then the other thing we're just simply going to do is to give what you naturally do already as the great teacher that you are. We're going to give it a language so that you can talk with other PEPSA participants about this process of inquiry. And you can also speak with your mentors and your card facilitators and everybody involved in the program. And it gives you this way to speak about the work that you do with students with autism that is extremely powerful. So enough said, because you can tell I'm so excited about introducing you to this process. So now let's actually look at the finer components of the process, and there are 5 of them. So here we are, we're moving into the second part of our agenda for this very first introduction to inquiry video, and that's looking at the 5 components of the inquiry process. And you see those 5 components right here on your screen. What we're going to do is take them one at a time, and I'm going to define them for you. So the first is wondering development. So what is a wondering? A wondering is a burning question that a teacher has about his or her practice. And wonderings emerge in the nexus of 2 places. That's the complexity of a teacher's work in the classroom. And we already talked about that, how complex the work of a teacher is. And again, similar to Michael Fullen's comment about as educators, problems are our friends, because the work of teaching is so complex, as teachers of students with autism, we experience felt difficulties and real world dilemmas on a daily basis. And again, that's all natural and normal and to be celebrated. And what we do is we find questions that we would like to explore and study in the middle of our complexity of our work and the problems, the felt difficulties, the real world dilemmas we're experiencing. So once a question is defined, how do we gain insights to that question in a systematic and intentional way? Well, that leads us to the second component, and that's data collection. Data collection for a teacher inquirer is defined as capturing the action, learning, and thinking that is occurring in the classroom and or the school. Schools, classrooms are busy places, so we want to try to just capture what's going on so that we can return to it and gain insights by looking at what has happened in relationship to the question we posed. So here you see a number of data collection strategies for a teacher researcher. And this is just a teaser because in the third video in the PEPSA inquiry video series, we are going to focus exclusively on this topic of data collection. And I'll be talking you through each one of the data collection strategies that you see on this screen. All right, so once data are collected, then we move on to the third component, and that component is called data analysis. For a teacher researcher or a teacher inquirer, data analysis is defined as simply this: creating a story of your learning as an inquirer based on a close and careful examination of your data. So one thing that is really important to recognize is there is a very tight connection between the component of data collection and data analysis. And it actually leads to two types of data analysis. There is formative data analysis, and that's how you're thinking about and what you're learning from your data as you collect it. And there's summative data analysis, which occurs at the end of the inquiry cycle, your progression through the five components. And again, this is a little teaser because we are going to have a whole video. The fourth video in the PEPSA inquiry video series is going to take you through the data analysis process step by step. So stay tuned. And when we get to the end of the video series, I'll be taking you through the data analysis process step by step. So then let's move on to the fourth component of the inquiry process, and that is sharing. Sharing for a teacher inquirer is simply defined as teachers collaborating. Collaboration can be so powerful when teachers get together. Teachers collaborating with one another to define and refine their investigations into practice, as well as communicate the results of their work with other professionals. So I'm going to show you a couple of images. I have been, as I mentioned, teaching about and coaching this process of inquiry for more than 3 decades. So I picked a couple of examples from the state of Florida, since you are doing your work in the state of Florida as well. So you see on this slide a professional development day, a staff development day from Pinellas County Schools. So that's a very large district in Florida. And I had the opportunity to work in that district with teachers there. And their work culminated with a professional learning day where they shared with each other the outcomes of the inquiries that they did into their practice. Now, Pinellas is a really big county, so here's a image from another county in the state of Florida, Levy County. And I also had the wonderful opportunity to work with the Northeast Florida Educational Consortium, teaching the process of inquiry to a number of smaller districts throughout the state of Florida, and then had the wonderful opportunity to visit Chiefland Middle School for their inquiry showcase. And that was a time that teachers in the district and in neighboring districts came together and shared their investigations into practice as well. And it can be so powerful. as teachers share what they've learned with one another. The best professional learning days ever are the ones where I've seen teachers just sharing with each other the outcomes of their inquiries. And you are going to have the opportunity to do that as a part of your PEPSA experience, which is just extremely exciting. And I know you're going to learn so much through the process. So finally, the last component of the inquiry process is action. And for a teacher inquirer, action is defined as making informed change and adjustment to teaching practice to improve learning for students. Now, I just talked about the five components of the inquiry process in a very linear way. I started with developing a wondering, then we went to data collection, then data analysis, then sharing, and then action. What I did is I artificially pulled apart a cyclical process in order to introduce you to each of the five components. So if you look here, you see, and this is a really important point to think about as you're introduced to inquiry, is we like things to be nice and neat, but the inquiry process is not that. It really unfolds not in a neat and tidy way, step by step. Instead, it's more of a cycle, and it's a messy cycle, meaning that you might start by developing a wondering, a question that you have, um, but then you'll collect a little data and you'll learn something, and you might cycle back to that wondering you developed, and you might tweak it and change it a little bit. Or you might actually start a cycle of inquiry with some data you collected, and looking at that data and analyzing it leads you to develop a question. So you can begin to see how it's messy, and you can jump back and forth between and among these different components as your work as an inquirer unfolds. All right, so yeah, you now have a definition of the inquiry process as well as a definition of each of the five components of that process that you see on this screen. And now what I'm going to do is ask you to actually take a break, because I know your brain can only hold so much, especially when you are staring at a screen and we are not live. So I'm going to ask you in a second to just pause this video, take a little break, get up and stretch a little bit, give your mind a little rest as you think about this definition and you think about the five components. Maybe grab a drink and a snack if you want to before returning to this. And then I'm also going to recommend that you take a piece of scrap paper, and that on that scrap paper, you maybe just jot down, it'll only take you a minute. This is one I did. It maybe took me 1 or 2 minutes. Just as a review of what we covered for yourself, jot down that inquiry cycle, make a little picture. You see in my picture, I put inquiry in the middle, and then I made sort of clouds, and I put the names of the five components of the inquiry process, and I drew the arrows back and forth to indicate it's a cycle and that it kind of is messy, that I can jump back and forth between these different five components. So go ahead and make yourself a little drawing on a piece of scrap paper. And the reason I'm asking you to take just 1 minute to do that is when we come back after the break, I am going to be taking you through an example of the inquiry process. And if you have this right beside you, it will help you recognize each of those different components in the example that I'm going to share with you. Okay, so take a minute now, pause the video, stretch, get a drink or a little snack, and grab a piece of scrap paper. Think back to what we've covered so far. Make yourself a very quick sketch of the inquiry process, and I'll see you back here in about 5 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your break and that it helped to have a little break. So now you can solidify the parts of the inquiry process that we learned about in the first part of this video. And now for me, this is the most exciting part is as we end up this video, I want to share with you an example of what inquiry actually looks like. So here we go. This is Debbie Hubble, and I taught Debbie the process of inquiry during a year-long professional development program for teachers across the state of Florida. And I met these teachers for one full day a month and both taught them the process and coached them through their first cycles of inquiry. Now, at one of our first meetings, after I introduced the process, just like I did for all of you, I asked teachers to think about and share what they would like to study. And Debbie, like many teachers, she was initially kind of stuck, not knowing where to focus her gaze for her first inquiry cycle. And so I said, Debbie, what keeps you up at night? What are you thinking about in the shower and on your way to work? And Debbie responded, well, that's easy, Nancy. I have 7 students in my class this year who are struggling readers. I know they need to take a high stakes test at the end of the year, and they're at risk for not passing the end of the year state exam. And I know that not passing will limit these students' options as they move into the 5th grade and middle school. And I desperately want to find a way to help these 7 learners become better readers. That's it, I said. You have found your felt difficulty, your real world dilemma. Now let's turn to the literature to see if we can learn anything that will help you frame your question. And so Debbie read some academic research on struggling readers and learned about the relationship between fluency development, and that is the ability to read with speed, accuracy, and proper expression, and reading comprehension. She also learned from the academic literature that repeated readings, and that's a simple exercise where students read and reread a selected short passage until they reach a satisfactory level of fluency, was one of the most studied strategies for developing reading fluency, and it offered great promise. She then remembered a book of fractured fairy tale plays she used to use with her students, but she put it away in the closet as emphasis on preparation for the end of the state test had begun taking up more and more of her time. Now, if you aren't familiar with fractured fairy tale plays, they are humorous takes on traditional fairy tales written in script form so that each child can play or read a part. So she reviewed these plays and she wondered, what is the relationship between my 4th graders' fluency development and the repeated readings of fractured fairy tale plays? So the first thing Debbie did is she developed an instructional plan to introduce these plays to her students. And you can see her plan here. On day 1, students chose parts. Debbie read the play to the group, and then students practiced silently. On day 2, students practiced silently, then aloud to the group, and and she followed with a short conference. And then the process continued, culminating with the students presenting aloud to the class at the end of the week. Now, as she was enacting this plan, Debbie collected 3 forms of data. First, Debbie administered dynamics indicators of basic early literacy skills, or DIBELS. So DIBELS are a set of standardized, individually administered measures of early literacy development. They are designed to be short, 1 minute fluency measures used to regularly monitor the development of pre-reading and early reading skills. In addition, Debbie took anecdotal notes each time she utilized fractured fairy tale plays with these fourth grade students, documenting their reactions, engagement, and Debbie's assessment of their fluency development with each reading of the play. Finally, Debbie relied on student work or artifacts as a third data source. At the end of the Fractured Fairy Tale series, Debbie asked her students to write Dear Mrs. Hubble letters, telling her about their perceptions and experiences with the Fractured Fairy Tale unit of study. So Debbie analyzed her data by charting student DIBEL scores over time, as well as organizing and reading through her anecdotal notes and student-produced artifacts multiple times as she looked for themes in her students' progress and reaction to multiple readings of the selected play each week, as well as discussing her data with colleagues. So, what did Debbie learn from this inquiry cycle? So, first, as this slide indicates, all students' DIBEL scores improved over time. In addition, Debbie found 3 themes based on her data that I'm going to describe each theme with some data excerpts to support that theme now. So the first theme that Debbie distilled from analyzing her data, she called enjoyment and enthusiasm. And one of the things that Debbie was passionate about in working with these 7 struggling readers was that she might bring some enjoyment and enthusiasm back to the act of reading, because in engaging in some of the skill and drill types of activities that were happening at a much more rapid pace and consuming more of reading time in preparation for that end of year state test, she felt that the enjoyment and enthusiasm for reading was kind of being sucked out of her students. And she didn't think that was productive for students who were struggling with the reading process. So she was thrilled to distill this theme from her data, that the fractured fairy tales were actually bringing more enjoyment and enthusiasm back to the process of reading. So here's one excerpt from her data, a Dear Mrs. Hubble letter that illustrates that. Dear Mrs. Hubble, I would like to do more fractured fairy tales because the fairy tales bring more happiness to the school day and more laughter to the morning and the evening. And we also learn a lesson from the tales. For instance, we learned from one of the plays that you don't have to be perfect to marry the prince. That lesson was from Spiderella. A second theme that Debbie distilled from her data, she called academic benefits. And one of the things that Debbie was very excited to see in her data was that the students were able to name for themselves the academic benefits of repeated readings of these fractured fairy tale plays. And she thought that was really important for her learners to be metacognitive about their learning process. And so these next 2 excerpts of data illustrate this idea of students' ability to articulate the academic benefits of reading the fractured fairy tale plays. Dear Mrs. Hubble, I really like doing the fractured fairy tales because they teach you a lesson. For example, the cheetah and the sloth play taught you to start slow and save your energy for later when you get to the finish line. I also like them because they help you read more fluently and with expression. Pow. a second excerpt from data to illustrate students' articulation of academic benefits. Dear Mrs. Hubble, I really did like it, and I would really want you to do more action fairy tales. And the last fairy tale we did, I learned lots of new words that I didn't know. So it helped me build my vocabulary and it helps you become more of a fluent reader. Pow. A third theme that Debbie distilled from analyzing her data was what she called positive social interactions. So, as Debbie observed and noticed what was going on with her learners as they engaged in these plays, she was realizing that they were interacting with each other and helping one another more with their reading skills because they were excited about getting the play to a point where they could share it with the class at the end of the week. So they actually started helping each other and encouraging each other in both their reading, their fluency, their expression, etc. And in particular, Debbie noticed one of her shyest learners in her classroom, who she described as being painfully shy, that engaging in this work really brought her out of her shell. And here's an excerpt from Debbie's data from that particular learner. Dear Mrs. Hubble, I like the plays we did in class, and I like to be in the plays too. I also like to entertain the class. From being in the plays, I learned to try your best at everything and do not be embarrassed. That was so powerful for Debbie to learn and distill from this data the way that engaging in this academic pursuit of reading fractured fairy tale plays using the evidence-based strategy of repeated reading and the research base showing that repeated readings can often lead to comprehension and better fluency can lead to comprehension, that it also had this fabulous um, outcome for the students in her class that they began developing a community of learners, got along well, helped each other, and particularly for this learner, brought her out of her shell. If Debbie was presenting here today, she always likes to end with summarizing this cycle of inquiry in the words of one of her students, and it's these words. I like fairy tales. Some teach me lessons. Some teach me how to read better. Others gives me ideas for writing class and improve my word vocab. I wish we could do them more often. There are a lot of fun and educational. And you see this student drew an illustration. She drew the Fractured Fairy Tale book that they were reading, plus herself, and she said that equals happiness. So after Debbie analyzed her data, she engaged in sharing what she learned from this inquiry with others. And this was a particular inquiry showcase that was occurring at a school that brought teachers from across North Central Florida together to share their cycles of inquiry with one another. So there you see her presenting her work. And then finally, taking action. So, what did this lead to? This idea of improving on her practice. So, the first thing that Debbie's cycle of inquiry led to was she realized that fluency development was really important, and her district was talking about the importance of targeting that. But as a school and as a district, they had no school-wide fluency objectives. So she led a committee to develop fluency objectives that could help guide all teachers of reading in all grade levels toward the development of their students' fluency. Another thing she realized, one of the things I love about the inquiry process, there's this saying, the fish would be the last creature to discover water. And sometimes we're so immersed in the act of teaching and the learning that we don't see some things that are right in front of us. And one of the things engaging in this cycle of inquiry did for Debbie is the second point. It helped her realize that when she assigns homework, what she has in her mind that would take learners maybe 10 minutes to do for homework, for her struggling readers, those who were reading 60 words per minute versus the students she had that were reading 180 words per minute, their homework would be much more arduous task for them and take a longer period of time. So, an action Debbie took is she began to differentiate and distinguish homework assignments based on fluency development and where her students were in relationship to how many words that they read per minute and how fluent that they were. She also used what she learned to make her listening centers more effective. And then finally, she developed this passion as well in her district. Fourth grade was the top of the elementary school, and her students, as fifth graders, would begin middle school next year. So she really wanted to make a connection with the middle school and even the high school. So let's form a bond and share what we've learned from working with a group of students that are struggling with the development of their reading skills and pass our knowledge over and over to one another so that as students move through our district, we can pick up and capitalize on the good work that they've done to improve as readers as they go through their education with us. So I want to end in Debbie's words, just as Debbie would often end her presentation of this inquiry cycle in the words of one of her students, because I think hearing about inquiry in the words of a teacher inquirer is really quite powerful. So in Debbie's words, teacher inquiry has become not something I do, but more a part of the way I think. It has become a gratifying response to formalizing the questions that enter my mind as I teach and doing something about them. Inquiry is a learning process that keeps me passionate about teaching. And that is what the inquiry process is all about. Remaining passionate about your teaching, being a student of your own teaching practice, being a student of the students with autism that you work with, learning with and from them, and then pouring what you learn through cycles of inquiry back into the work that you do with the students. Truly becoming the very best teacher you can be for every student with autism that you work with. So that is our introduction to the cycle of inquiry. And I want to end each video with a question for you to ponder as you move forward from this video into your work within the PEPSA program. So for this particular introduction to inquiry video, this is the question I'd like to leave you with to consider. Based on Debbie's example, in what ways do you believe inquiry might be useful to you in your work with students with autism? Thank you for joining me in this introduction to inquiry. And what I have left to say is happy inquiring to all of you in PEPSA. And I will be joining you again in the second inquiry video to begin teaching you a bit more about the finer components of the inquiry process, beginning with the development of a wondering. Happy inquiring!